The acrid sting of smoke clawed at Abigail's throat, each rasping breath a gamble under the shuddering floorboards. Outside, the world had ended in screams and Navajo war cries, the stench of blood already thick in the desert air. Her husband, Thomas, his laughter, his dreams, silenced forever by the brutal efficiency of a raiding party. Now, a shadow sliced through the thin crack of light above. It was Chayton, the warrior whose war axe had just widowed her, hunting for survivors. Baby John, nestled against her thundering heart, was a fragile secret in a world suddenly drenched in his father's blood. Death was not just near, it was peering down at her, its face hard as mountain granite. But as the warrior's eyes, cold as winter stone, met hers, a desperate, impossible notion flared in Abigail's mind. It was not a plea for mercy, but a defiant trade, her life, her knowledge, for the precious life of her son. Could she truly forge a deal with the devil himself, here in the smoldering ashes of all she held dear? Real quick, before we continue this amazing story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments. I read every one. And if you enjoyed true Western tales like this, hit that like button and consider subscribing. I've got more incredible stories coming that you won't want to miss. Their homestead, a tiny, brave scar on the vast, indifferent face of the painted desert, had been built on Thomas's unwavering belief in tomorrow. Promise Point, Abigail. He'd called their patch of stubborn earth, his voice filled with the vibrant hope that had drawn her to him. A new beginning, far from the crowded, tired East. Here, a man can carve out a life with his own two hands, and his woman can make a home. Abigail, more grounded in the harsh realities of frontier life, had loved his optimism, even as she harbored a quiet pragmatism. She knew the desert kept its own counsel. Its beauty was a fierce, untamed thing that could turn deadly in an instant. Their cabin, a testament to months of shared labor, stood solitary against the sweeping vistas of red rock and distant, hazy mesas. Days were a rhythm of survival. Thomas wrestled with the arid soil, his brow perpetually beaded with sweat. Abigail tended their meager garden, preserving every edible scrap, her hands already chapped and worn. And always, there was baby John, a small, warm miracle in their often chilling isolation. Abigail carried within her a legacy of quiet strength, inherited from her mother. Her mother was a woman who had faced down her own share of prairie sorrows and had learned the earth's secret language. "Listen to the land, child," her mother would say, her fingers deftly sorting herbs. "It offers remedies the fancy doctors haven't dreamed of, if you've the eyes to see and the heart to learn." These lessons, whispered over simmering pots and during long firelit evenings, had become Abigail's hidden arsenal. She knew which roots could soothe a fever, which leaves could draw out infection, which berries, though bitter, held life. Thomas admired her skills, but sometimes found her caution excessive. When old Jedediah Finn, a grizzled trapper passing through months earlier, had warned of growing unrest among the Navajo tribes, of treaties broken by white men further east, and patience wearing thin as buffalo grew scarce, Thomas had clapped him on the back. "We're peaceful folk, Jed. We keep to ourselves. No quarrel with us." Abigail, however, had felt a familiar coldness touch her spine. She'd seen the distant smoke signals. She noticed how the usual desert creatures had sometimes seemed unnaturally silent, as if holding their breath. The land itself felt different, watchful, but she'd pushed her fears down for Thomas's sake, for the dream of Promise Point. The morning the dream shattered began like any other, with the desert sun painting the sky in strokes of fiery orange and soft lavender. Abigail was humming softly to baby John, the aroma of freshly ground coffee, a small, civilized comfort. Thomas was outside, his cheerful whistling audible as he checked the tethers on their two precious horses. Then the whistle cut off, replaced by a sound that froze Abigail's blood. It was a high, ululating war cry, multiplied, echoing off the canyon walls. She flew to the cabin's single, small window, her heart leaping into her throat. Warriors, at least a dozen, painted, fearsome, erupting from the cover of the scrub like vengeful spirits of the land. Their leader, Chayton, rode at their head, a figure of terrifying power. His movements were fluid and deadly, an extension of the unforgiving landscape itself. Thomas never had a prayer. He yelled her name, a desperate warning, then spun, grabbing for the rifle propped against the cabin wall. Abigail saw him raise it, saw the flash of a shot, then saw him stumble, an arrow sprouting from his chest. Another warrior was on him in an instant, the glint of a raised tomahawk. Abigail screamed, a raw, animal sound of pure agony, but it was lost in the cacophony of the attack. Instinct, primal and overwhelming, took over. She snatched baby John, her mind a white blur of terror, and scrambled towards the tiny, concealed root cellar in the corner of their pantry. She'd insisted Thomas dig it deeper than he'd thought necessary. "For storms, Thomas, or other troubles." He chuckled then. No one was chuckling now. She ripped away the rough-hewn plank that served as its door, plunged into the cool, earthy darkness, and pulled the plank back into place, just as the cabin door burst inward with a sickening crack of splintering wood. Above her, the sounds of destruction echoed. Heavy, moccasined feet thudded on the wooden floor. Guttural shouts filled the air, alongside the shattering of pottery and the tearing of fabric. Her world was being ripped apart, board by board. She pressed John so tightly against her, she feared she might hurt him. Her hand clamped over his mouth, praying he wouldn't cry out. The smell of smoke began to seep through the cracks, acrid and terrifying. They were burning it all, burning Promise Point to the ground. How long she cowered there, Abigail never knew. Time dissolved into a single, unending moment of suffocating fear. Then, gradually, the sounds of rampage faded. They were replaced by the hungry crackle of flames and an almost more terrifying silence. Were they gone? Hope, a dangerous, flickering ember, dared to glow. She waited, muscles screaming from her cramped position, until the silence stretched, taut and unbearable. Slowly, agonizingly, she pushed at the plank above. Smoke billowed in, making her cough, but through the haze, she saw him. Chayton, standing like a bronze statue amidst the devastation, his chest heaving slightly, his dark eyes scanning the ruins of her life. He was alone. Perhaps the others had ridden off, sated with destruction. His gaze, sharp as a hawk's, swept the area, missing nothing. He was a hunter, and this was his domain. He took a step, then another, directly towards her hiding place. Had she made a noise? Dislodged a pebble? The plank was ripped away with a sudden, violent force. Light, choked with smoke and menace, flooded her hiding place. Abigail recoiled, shielding John, every muscle tense for the final, brutal blow. She squeezed her eyes shut. This was it. When she forced them open, Chayton loomed above her, war club held loosely at his side, but his presence was an undeniable threat. His face, smeared with ochre and black, was a mask of grim victory and cold intent. This was no negotiation, no parley. This was the aftermath of a battle she had already lost. Despair, absolute and crushing, washed over her. Her baby, her innocent John, who had known only love and the warmth of her arms, he would die here, in this hole, because they had dared to dream in a land that was not theirs to claim. Tears, hot and silent, streamed down Abigail's smoke-stained cheeks. She offered no resistance, no plea. What was the use? Chayton shifted. His eyes briefly flicked to the small bundle in her arms, then back to her face. He raised the club slightly. It was then, in that split second between life and utter annihilation, that her gaze fixed, not on the weapon, but on the object, nestled against the hard muscle of his chest. It was a small, intricately carved wooden amulet, dark with age and handling. It depicted a larger figure protectively bent over a smaller one, a parent and child. The image burned itself into Abigail's desperate mind. An idea, wild and untamed as the land itself, exploded within her. A gamble of such magnitude, it defied all reason, but it was the only card she had left to play. As Chayton's arm tensed, readying the blow, she didn't scream. She cried out, her voice hoarse, cracking, "Wait, your child! Is there a sickness? I can help!" Chayton froze. His dark eyes narrowed. A flicker of something unreadable, perhaps surprise or disdain, crossed his hardened features. He lowered his club a fraction, his gaze intense, searching. Abigail, emboldened by that fractional hesitation, pushed herself up a little. She never took her eyes off his, always keeping baby John protectively cradled. She pointed a trembling finger at the amulet. "That," she gasped, her voice gaining a desperate strength. "A child. Your child." Then she pointed to baby John, then to herself. She mimed grinding herbs in her palm, offering a cup, smoothing a brow. "Healing," she managed, the word tasting foreign and powerful on her tongue. "I know herbs, fevers, sickness. I can make well." He remained silent, a granite statue of suspicion. She could see the conflict warring in his eyes. The warrior's instinct to finish the job, to eliminate the enemy, versus something else, something sparked by her desperate words and the sight of the amulet she dared to reference. "It's no trick," she whispered, tears still tracking through the grime on her face. "My mother taught me. Please, a life for a life. My skill for his." She pointed to baby John. He studied her, then her child, then the smoldering remains of what had been her home. His face was unreadable, but the tight line of his jaw suggested an internal battle. Finally, after an eternity that stretched Abigail's nerves to the breaking point, he gave a single, curt nod and gestured with his club. "Out." The word was a growl, heavy with unspoken conditions, but it was not the word of death she had expected. The bindings on her wrists were tight, chafing, but Chayton had allowed her to keep baby John secured in the sling she'd hastily fashioned. The journey to the Navajo encampment was a silent torment. Each step Abigail took over the broken, sun-scorched earth was a step further into an unknown, terrifying future. The sun climbed, a merciless eye in the vast, cloudless sky, beating down on her unprotected head. Thirst was a constant companion, and her legs ached with a weariness that went bone deep. Chayton walked beside her, sometimes slightly ahead. His silence was more unnerving than any threat. He moved with an animal grace, seemingly tireless, his senses alert to every whisper of the wind, every rustle in the sparse, thorny brush. Abigail tried to read his expression, but his face remained a stoic mask. Was he reconsidering his decision? Would he suddenly decide she was not worth the trouble? She clutched John tighter, whispering soothing nonsense to him, her own heart a frantic drum against his small body. After hours that felt like days, they crested a low rise. Below, nestled in a hidden basin, shielded by red rock formations, lay the Navajo camp. It was larger than she'd imagined, a sprawling collection of hogans and temporary shelters, with thin plumes of smoke rising from scattered cook fires. The sounds of the camp, the barking of dogs, the distant shouts of children, the low murmur of voices, reached her, alien and menacing. As they descended, figures emerged from the dwellings. Their faces turned towards the newcomers. Abigail felt 100 hostile eyes upon her. Whispers, like dry leaves skittering in the wind, followed their progress. She was the enemy, the survivor of the raid, a white woman brought into their midst. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her skin. Chayton ignored the stares and the murmurs. He led her with an air of grim purpose towards a hogan set slightly apart from the others. The air inside was heavy. It was thick with the scent of sickness, herbs, and despair. A woman, her face, a mask of exhaustion and worry, looked up as they entered. Her eyes, dark pools of sorrow, darted from Chayton to Abigail, then rested on the small, still form lying on a pile of furs in the dimmest corner of the hogan. It was a boy, perhaps 5 or 6 summers old. His skin was flushed, a dangerous, mottled red. His breathing was shallow and disturbingly rapid. This was Little Owl, Chayton's son. An old man, His face, a roadmap of wrinkles and desert wisdom, was crouched beside the boy, softly chanting a rhythmic prayer. This was the medicine man, and the look he gave Abigail was one of pure, unadulterated contempt. He clearly saw her as an unwelcome intrusion, a profanity in this sacred space of healing. Chayton spoke in the flowing, guttural tones of his own language. His voice was low but carried an undeniable authority. Abigail didn't understand the words, but she saw the flicker of resistance in the medicine man's eyes, the desperate hope in the mother's "Delegale." Then Chayton turned to Abigail. He gestured towards his son, then locked his gaze with hers. His meaning was brutally clear. Heal him. The unspoken consequence of failure hung in the air, as heavy and suffocating as the sick room smells. If he dies? Chayton didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Abigail felt the weight of that implicit threat settle upon her, a crushing burden. But alongside the fear, a different emotion surged. It was a fierce maternal determination. She had made a bargain. She would honor it. For John. For this unknown child. For the sliver of a chance that lay beyond this terrible ordeal. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Abigail knelt beside little Owl. Her touch was surprisingly gentle as she laid her palm on his forehead. He was burning. His small lips were cracked and dry, his breath short, painful gasps. Her mind raced, cataloging her mother's teachings. This was a deep fever, one that consumed from within. She needed water, cool compresses, and specific herbs. She looked at little Owl's mother, whose name she later learned was Nahiza, and tried to communicate with gestures. Water, cloth, a grinding stone. Nahiza looked hesitantly at Chayton, who gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. While Nahiza fetched what she could, Abigail tried to explain to Chayton that she needed to search for plants outside the camp. She pointed to the earth, mime digging roots, plucking leaves. Chayton's suspicion was still a palpable barrier. The medicine man, who had been watching with narrowed eyes, let out a derisive snort and spoke sharply to Chayton, clearly disparaging the idea. Abigail saw Chayton's jaw tighten. He was caught between his tribe's traditions and this desperate, last-ditch hope offered by an enemy. Finally, his fear for his son won out. He summoned two young, stern-faced warriors. Their expressions left no doubt that they were her guards, not her assistants. For the next few hours, under the blazing sun and the unwavering scrutiny of her escorts, Abigail searched the seemingly barren land around the encampment. Baby John, secured to her back, whimpered occasionally, uncomfortable in the heat. The warriors offered no help. Their silence was a heavy blanket. But Abigail's eyes, trained by her mother, saw what others missed. She found a precious stand of willow shrubs huddled near a seep of moisture, their leaves a dusty green. She carefully stripped bark from several branches. She unearthed a few gnarled roots she recognized and gathered a handful of specific leaves from a low-growing plant. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. Back in the dim hogan, she set to work. The medicine man watched her every move, his disapproval radiating like a chill. Once, as she prepared a poultice, he muttered something and reached for Little Owl, perhaps to administer one of his own concoctions. Abigail, her heart leaping, firmly but respectfully shook her head. She met his glare with a steady gaze of her own. Chayton, observing from the shadows, said nothing, but his eyes didn't leave them. Abigail instructed Nahiza to boil the willow bark into a strong tea. She crushed the leaves for a poultice, mixing them with a little water to form a paste. She gently bathed Little Owl's feverish skin with cool water, murmuring soft, soothing words, much as she did for her own son. The hours crawled by. Chayton remained a silent, brooding presence in the corner. His face was an unreadable mask of tension. Nahiza hovered, her hope and fear warring in her eyes. The medicine man came and went, his skepticism a constant, unspoken challenge. Night fell, and the camp outside grew quiet, save for the distant howl of a coyote. Inside the hogan, the only sounds were Little Owl's labored breathing, John's occasional soft stirrings, and the quiet rhythm of Abigail's work. She was exhausted. Her body ached, her spirit stretched thin, but she pushed on, driven by a primal instinct to save, to heal. This was her only path out of the darkness. As the first pale light of dawn touched the canyon rim, Abigail, slumped with fatigue beside Little Owl, noticed a change. The boy's breathing, so shallow and ragged for so long, seemed to deepen. It began to find a more regular rhythm. The angry flush on his skin started to recede, replaced by a less alarming warmth. She laid her hand on his forehead. It was still hot, but the ferocious, consuming fire of the fever felt banked, subdued. Little Owl stirred. His eyelids fluttered, then opened. For a moment, they were unfocused. Then they cleared, finding his father's face in the dim light. A tiny, weak smile touched his lips. "Atsa," he whispered, the Navajo word for father. His voice was barely a thread of sound. Chayton was beside him in an instant, his powerful frame trembling. He dropped to his knees. His hand, the one that had wielded the war club with such deadly force, now touched his son's cheek with infinite gentleness. A sound escaped him. It was a choked sob of relief so profound it seemed to shake his very soul. He looked at Abigail, and in his eyes, the warrior's harshness was gone. It was replaced by a raw, unfiltered gratitude that transcended language, enmity, and the chasm of their two worlds. He saw not the white enemy, but the woman who had battled death for his son and won. Later that morning, with Little Owl sleeping peacefully, taking sips of broth Nahi's spoon fed him, Chayton approached Abigail. He sat before her, not as a captor, but as something else entirely. He held out the amulet from around his neck. He touched it, then pointed to Little Owl, and then his hand swept towards the ground. His face contorted with a pain that was still fresh. He spoke a few broken words in English, supplemented by expressive gestures. "My wife," he said, his voice thick. "Same, sick, gone." Abigail understood. The fierce warrior, the terror of the plains, was also a grieving husband. He was a father who had faced the abyss of losing his only child to the same fate that had claimed his beloved partner. His aggression, his raid on their homestead, was perhaps born not just of territorial dispute, but from a heart already fractured by loss. A man lashing out at a world that had dealt him unbearable sorrow. In that moment, the enemy dissolved, revealing a man, flawed and hurting, much like any other. News of Little Owl's miraculous recovery, and the white woman's role in it, rippled through the Navajo camp. Suspicion did not vanish overnight. Old wounds and deep-seated mistrust ran too deep for that. But it was now mingled with a grudging awe. Chayton, however, was unwavering. He gathered his tribal elders. His voice resonated with newfound conviction as he spoke of the debt owed. He declared that Abigail and her child were under his sacred protection. The bargain, struck in the ashes of her home, would be honored, and then some. He would not simply release her into the wilderness. He understood the immense debt he owed, a debt of life. He ordered provisions gathered for her, dried meats, a full water skin, a warm woven blanket. He even pressed into her hand the small, sharp skinning knife that had been Thomas's, a gesture of respect that brought a fresh wave of tears to Abigail's eyes. He then announced his decision. He and two of his most trusted braves, men whose loyalty was unquestionable, would escort her to Havenwood. It was a small, neutral settlement, several days' ride, known for its uneasy but generally peaceful coexistence with the tribes. It was, he judged, her best chance. The journey to Havenwood was surreal. Abigail, with baby John secure and sleeping most of the way, rode one of Chayton's own ponies. Chayton and his warriors, Silent Fox and Stonehand, flanked her. They moved with the quiet efficiency of the land itself. There was little talk, but the silence was no longer fraught with menace. It was a silence of acknowledgement, of a fragile truce forged in shared crisis. Chayton, riding tall, was no longer the fearsome raider, but a solemn guardian. He ensured she had water, pointed out edible berries, and chose sheltered spots for their brief nightly camps. His warriors, though still reserved, treated her with a distant courtesy that spoke volumes of their leader's command. On the third day, they crested a familiar rise. Below them lay Havenwood, a dusty cluster of buildings looking small and vulnerable against the vastness of the landscape. The sight of smoke curling from its chimneys, the distant sound of a blacksmith's hammer, filled Abigail with a complex mix of relief and trepidation. As they approached the outskirts, the settlers of Havenwood stopped their labors. Their faces were a mixture of astonishment and alarm. A white woman, clearly a survivor, escorted by 3 imposing Navajo warriors, was not a common sight. Chayton reined in his horse at the edge of the tilled fields. He turned to Abigail. His dark eyes met hers, conveying a depth of understanding that needed no words. He had brought her to safety. The debt was paid. He gave a single, profound nod. It was a gesture of farewell and respect. Then, he and his warriors wheeled their ponies and, without a backward glance, melted into the rugged landscape. They disappeared as silently and suddenly as they had first appeared in her life. Abigail watched them go, a lump in her throat. Then, taking a deep breath, her arm protectively around baby John, she urged her pony forward, towards the uncertain sanctuary of Havenwood. Life in Havenwood was a daily struggle. Abigail, the grieving widow with an infant son, was an object of pity and quiet speculation. She found lodging with Martha, the pastor's kind-hearted wife, and slowly began to weave herself into the fabric of the small community. She took in mending, helped with chores, her past a carefully guarded story. She never spoke in detail of Chayton, or the full circumstances of her survival. She knew the tale might be too wild, too unbelievable for this small, God-fearing town. But in the quiet of the night, as she held John close, the memory of the fierce warrior who had shown her unexpected mercy would return. She would think of Little Owl and of a bargain made in the shadow of death that had somehow, miraculously, led to life. She knew that the chasm between their peoples remained wide and treacherous. But for a brief, extraordinary time, a bridge had been built, forged by a mother's desperate love and a father's profound grief. In the vast, untamed heart of the West, where survival was a daily battle, sometimes the most unexpected encounters could redefine the very meaning of enemy and friend, leaving echoes that would linger long after the dust had settled.